The cameras were rolling, the nation was watching, and in one devastating moment, Keir Starmer did the unthinkable. He threw his own Chancellor under the bus. Live on air, leaving Rachel Reeves blindsided and humiliated. What happened next was explosive. Behind closed doors, Reeves erupted in fury, unleashing her rage at the Prime Minister who'd just sacrificed her to save his own skin. This isn't just another political spat. This is the beginning of a civil war at the heart of Labour, and the fallout could destroy Starmer's government before it even gets started. The knives are out, the battle lines are drawn, and someone's political career is about to be obliterated. This is the story of betrayal at the highest level of British politics. It started with a simple interview, routine, controlled, and nothing out of the ordinary. Keir Starmer sat across from a journalist, calm and collected as always, ready to defend his government's economic policies. Rachel Reeves had spent weeks crafting the budget, navigating impossible choices, taking hits from all sides. She'd been the face of Labour's economic plan, standing in Parliament, defending every controversial decision, every unpopular cut, every tax rise that had the public and the media howling for blood. And through it all, Starmer had stood beside her. Or so she thought. The question came like a missile. The journalist leaned forward, pressing Starmer on the budget's most controversial elements. The tax increases that had businesses screaming, the benefit cuts that had charities in uproar, the spending decisions that had even Labour's own backbenchers muttering rebellion. Everyone knew these were political landmines. Everyone knew someone would have to take responsibility. What nobody expected was what Starmer said next. He distanced himself. Right there, live on national television, the Prime Minister began separating himself from his own Chancellor's budget. He talked about how these were difficult decisions, how the Chancellor had to make tough choices, how he understood people's concerns. The words were careful, calculated, but the message was crystal clear. This wasn't our budget. This was her budget. These weren't our mistakes. These were her mistakes. In political terms, he'd just hung Rachel Reeves out to dry. The political world erupted instantly. Social media exploded with clips of the interview. Journalists were frantically typing analysis pieces. Opposition MPs were already preparing their attacks, sensing blood in the water. But nowhere was the reaction more intense than inside Number 10 itself, because Rachel Reeves was watching, and she was absolutely livid. Sources inside Downing Street describe what happened next as nuclear. Reeves stormed through the corridors of power, her face thunderous, her team scrambling to keep up. She'd just been publicly undermined by her own Prime Minister. Humiliated in front of the entire country, made to look like a rogue operator who'd gone off script, when in reality, every single decision in that budget had been signed off by Starmer himself. Every tax rise, every cut, every controversial policy had his fingerprints all over it. And now he was pretending otherwise. The confrontation was inevitable. Behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the microphones, Rachel Reeves let loose. Witnesses describe her as incandescent with rage, barely able to contain her fury. She had spent months defending policies that were destroying her public image, taking bullets for a Prime Minister who was supposed to have her back. And at the first sign of trouble, he'd thrown her to the wolves. This wasn't just bad politics, this was personal betrayal. But here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't a one-off moment of weakness from Starmer. This was part of a pattern that's been developing since Labour took power. Time and time again, when difficult decisions needed defending, it was Rachel Reeves standing at the dispatch box, facing the fury of Parliament. When unpopular announcements had to be made, it was Reeves doing the press conferences. And when the political heat became unbearable, suddenly Starmer was nowhere to be found. The Treasury insiders started talking. Anonymous briefings began appearing in newspapers, painting a picture of a Chancellor who felt isolated, unsupported, and increasingly aware that she was being set up as the fall guy. One source close to Reeves described the situation bluntly. She's realised she's expendable. She's the human shield they're using to absorb all the political damage, and when she's too damaged to be useful anymore, they'll discard her. The timing of Starmer's betrayal couldn't have been worse. Labour's poll numbers were already sliding. The economic news was getting grimmer by the day. The public was turning hostile, angry about broken promises and policies that seemed to hurt ordinary people while protecting the wealthy. The government needed unity and it needed to present a solid front. Instead, it was tearing itself apart on national television. But Rachel Reeves isn't someone who takes betrayal lying down. She didn't claw her way up through Labour's ranks. Didn't survive years in opposition, didn't become the first female chancellor in British history by being a pushover, and she certainly wasn't going to let Keir Starmer destroy her career to save his own. The fight back began immediately. Reeves's team started their own briefing operation, making sure journalists knew the truth, that every controversial policy had been a collective cabinet decision, that Starmer had approved everything, that the Prime Minister was trying to rewrite history to protect himself. The message was clear. If Starmer wanted a war, he'd get one. Cabinet meetings became tense, uncomfortable affairs. The easy camaraderie that had characterised Labour's first months in power evaporated. Ministers started choosing sides, calculating which horse to back in this brewing civil war. Some stayed loyal to Starmer, the man who'd led them to victory. Others gravitated toward Reeves, impressed by her competence and disgusted by how she'd been treated. The Parliamentary Labour Party started fracturing too. MPs who'd always been sceptical of Starmer's leadership saw this as confirmation of their worst fears, that he was more interested in his own image than in standing by his team, that he'd sacrifice anyone to avoid taking responsibility. The WhatsApp groups were buzzing with gossip, speculation, and increasingly open criticism of the Prime Minister. And through it all, the British public watched in growing dismay. They'd voted for change. They'd voted for competent government after years of conservative chaos. Instead, they were getting yet another political soap opera, yet another government eating itself alive. The disappointment was palpable and it was showing up in the polls. The media had a field day. Every newspaper, every news channel, every political commentator wanted their piece of the story. This wasn't just about policy disagreements or strategic differences. This was about trust, loyalty, and the fundamental question of what kind of leader Keir Starmer actually was. The think pieces wrote themselves. Can a Prime Minister who won't back his Chancellor survive? Is Rachel Reeves about to resign? Is Labour's government already doomed? Behind the scenes, frantic damage control was underway. Starmer's team knew they'd made a catastrophic mistake. The interview was supposed to take heat off the Prime Minister. Instead, it had created a firestorm that threatened to consume the entire government. They needed to fix this, and fast. But how do you repair trust that's been so publicly shattered? The first attempt at reconciliation was clumsy, almost insulting. Starmer's spokesperson issued a statement praising Rachel Reeves' work as Chancellor, talking about how much confidence the Prime Minister had in her, but the words rang hollow. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone knew what Starmer had done. A carefully worded press release wasn't going to make anyone forget that moment of betrayal. Reeves wasn't buying it either. Sources say she rejected multiple attempts by Starmer's team to arrange a private meeting to smooth things over. She wasn't interested in quiet words and empty promises. The damage had been done in public, and as far as she was concerned, any apology needed to be just as public. But that would require Starmer to admit he'd made a mistake, to acknowledge he'd wronged his Chancellor, and that simply wasn't happening. The Conservative opposition was having the time of their lives. Every Prime Minister's questions became an opportunity to exploit this crack in Labour's facade. They'd ask Starmer if he backed his Chancellor, they'd quote his interview back at him, they'd force him to choose between doubling down on his betrayal or admitting he'd been wrong. It was political torture and there was no good answer. But the real danger wasn't coming from the opposition. It was coming from within Labour itself, because this incident had crystallised something that many MPs had been feeling but hadn't articulated: a growing unease about Starmer's leadership style, his tendency to be calculating rather than principled, his willingness to sacrifice others to preserve his own position, his apparent inability to inspire genuine loyalty. Rachel Reeves had allies. Powerful ones. MPs who respected her competence and were appalled by how she had been treated. Ministers who knew they could be next if they fell out of favour. Union leaders who valued her working class roots and suspected Starmer of being too comfortable with the establishment. These people were starting to ask dangerous questions. If Starmer could do this to his own Chancellor, who else would he throw under the bus? The Treasury became a fortress. Reeves made it clear that she wasn't going anywhere, wasn't resigning, wasn't giving Starmer the satisfaction of an easy exit. If he wanted rid of her, he'd have to fire her, and that would be political suicide. The first female Chancellor dismissed by a Labour Prime Minister for implementing policies he'd approved. The optics would be catastrophic. So instead, there was stalemate, a cold war at the heart of government. Starmer and Reeves barely speaking, their teams briefing against each other, cabinet meetings conducted in icy silence. And all the while, the country's problems kept mounting. The economy wasn't fixing itself. Public services were still crumbling. People were still struggling, but the government was too busy fighting itself to actually govern. The pressure on Starmer intensified. Senior Labour figures, party grandees, who'd stayed silent until now, started making their views known. Some called for unity, urging both sides to find a way forward. Others were more direct, suggesting that Starmer needed to publicly back his Chancellor or face the consequences. A few even hinted that if this situation didn't improve, there might need to be a leadership conversation. That's when things got really interesting. Because leadership challenges in British politics don't usually come out of nowhere. They build slowly, gathering momentum until suddenly they're unstoppable. And all the signs were there. The muttering in the tea rooms, the private conversations between MPs, the WhatsApp groups discussing whether someone needed to wield the knife. History shows that once a Prime Minister loses the confidence of their party, the end can come very quickly indeed. Starmer tried to regain control. He gave speeches about unity and collective responsibility. He made public appearances with Rachel Reeves, both of them smiling for the cameras, pretending everything was fine. But nobody was fooled. The body language told the real story, the forced smiles, the careful distance, the complete absence of warmth. This wasn't a partnership. This was two people who could barely stand to be in the same room. The policy implications were severe. Major economic decisions were being delayed because Starmer and Reeves couldn't agree on how to present them. Important announcements were being watered down to avoid giving either side ammunition. The government was paralysed, unable to move decisively on anything because the two most important people in it weren't speaking properly. And the country was paying the price. International observers started taking notice too. Foreign leaders and investors watching British politics with growing alarm. They'd hoped Labour would bring stability after years of Conservative chaos. Instead, they were seeing a government imploding in slow motion. The pound started to wobble. Business confidence took another hit. Britain's reputation as a stable, predictable place to invest was taking yet another battering. Back in Westminster, the plotting intensified, small groups of MPs meeting in private, discussing options. Could they force Starmer to make a full public apology? Could they pressure him to give Reeves more power and autonomy? Could they build enough support to challenge his leadership if it came to that? The conversations were careful, tentative, but they were happening. And once that kind of talk starts, it's very hard to stop. Rachel Reeves herself remained defiant. In public appearances, she defended her budget with renewed vigour, making it crystal clear that these were government policies, not just her personal initiatives. She name-checked Starmer repeatedly, tying him to every decision, making it impossible for him to distance himself further without looking completely ridiculous. It was political warfare conducted with surgical precision. The media loved it. Every day brought new revelations, new anonymous briefings, new hints about the depth of the rift. Political journalists competed to get the best inside information, the most devastating quote, the clearest sense of just how bad things had become. Some started writing obituaries for Starmer's leadership. Others predicted Reeves would be gone within months. Everyone had a theory and none of them were good for Labour. Then came the moment that changed everything. A crucial vote in Parliament, one that required absolute unity from Labour MPs to pass. It was a key plank of the government's economic policy, something that Rachel Reeves had championed and that required her personal credibility to sell to wavering backbenchers. The vote was tight. Every Labour MP needed to turn up and vote the right way. There was no room for rebellion, no margin for error. Keir Starmer made the calculation that this was his moment, his chance to demonstrate authority, to bring Reeves to heel, to show everyone who was really in charge. He could have reached out, could have built bridges, could have found a way to unite the party behind this crucial vote. Instead, he made demands. He wanted Reeves to publicly acknowledge his leadership, to defer to him in appearances, to essentially subordinate herself. It was a power play, pure and simple. Rachel Reeves refused. She'd spent weeks taking political bullets for policies that Starmer had approved but wouldn't defend. She'd been humiliated on national television by a prime minister who'd thrown her under the bus to save himself. She was done bending the knee. The message she sent back to Starmer's team was blunt. Back me properly, apologise publicly for that interview, and I'll deliver the votes. Keep playing games and you're on your own. The standoff sent shockwaves through Westminster. Here was the Chancellor refusing to play ball with the Prime Minister on a critical vote. It was the kind of open defiance that governments don't survive. Frantic negotiations began. Party managers tried to find a compromise. Senior ministers attempted to mediate, but both sides had dug in. Starmer wouldn't apologise. Reeves wouldn't back down. The night before the vote, rebel Labour MPs started making their intentions known. Some said they'd abstain, others hinted they might vote against. The numbers started to look dire. Starmer was facing the prospect of his first major parliamentary defeat, and it would be entirely self-inflicted. The government could fall. There could be a vote of no confidence. Everything Labour had worked for could collapse because the Prime Minister and Chancellor couldn't work together. That's when the real pressure started. The party's biggest donors made calls threatening to withdraw funding if this chaos continued. Union leaders demanded an emergency meeting, making clear they wouldn't support a divided government. Former Labour Prime Ministers weighed in, speaking publicly about the need for unity and privately reading both Starmer and Reeves the Riot Act. The message was unanimous. Fix this or everyone loses. The compromise, when it finally came, satisfied nobody, but probably saved the government. Starmer agreed to give an interview where he'd speak more supportively about his Chancellor, though he still wouldn't explicitly apologise. Reeves agreed to do a joint appearance with him before the vote, presenting a united front. Neither side was happy, but both recognised that the alternative was mutual destruction. The vote passed, but barely. A handful of Labour MPs still rebelled, sending a clear message that Starmer's authority was damaged, perhaps irreparably. The relief in number 10 was palpable, but everyone knew this was just a temporary reprieve. The fundamental issues remained unresolved. The trust was still broken, the relationship was still toxic. In the days that followed, both camps tried to claim victory. Starmer's team briefed that the Prime Minister had faced down a rebellious Chancellor and restored order. Reeves's supporters countered that she'd forced Starmer to back down from his demands and secured better treatment. The reality was that both had lost. The public had watched their government nearly tear itself apart over personal grievances while real problems went unsolved. The damage to Labour's polling was catastrophic. Voters who'd supported them just months earlier were turning away in disgust. The promise of competent, stable government had been exposed as a fantasy. The Conservatives, still reeling from their own historic defeat, suddenly saw a path back to relevance. If Labour kept imploding like this, they might not even need a coherent plan. They could just wait for their opponents to destroy themselves. Inside the Labour Party, the wounds remained raw. MPs who'd been forced to take sides in the Starmer-Reeves war found it hard to forget or forgive. Cabinet meetings remained tense. The easy assumption that this government would last a full term started to seem optimistic. Some were already quietly discussing what came next, who might replace Starmer if he couldn't recover, how they'd rebuild once the current leadership collapsed. For Rachel Reeves, the experience was clarifying. She'd learned exactly how much she could trust Keir Starmer, which was not at all. She'd learnt that being competent and hard-working wasn't enough protection against political betrayal. And she'd learnt that in the ruthless world of Westminster politics, you couldn't rely on anyone but yourself. Her allies watched as she became harder, more calculating, more willing to play the dark arts of political warfare. For Starmer, the damage might be terminal. He'd won the battle, but potentially lost the war. Yes, he was still Prime Minister. Yes, his government had survived. But his reputation had taken a devastating hit. The image he'd cultivated of being a straight dealer, someone different from the usual political operators, had been shattered. He was now seen as just another leader willing to sacrifice anyone to save himself. The irony wasn't lost on political observers. Starmer had spent years attacking the Conservatives for their infighting, their tendency to devour their own leaders, their inability to put country before party. And now, barely months into power, Labour was displaying exactly the same pathologies. The cycle of British political dysfunction continued regardless of which party was in charge. As for the public, they watched with weary resignation. Another government consumed by internal drama. Another set of leaders more interested in fighting each other than fixing problems. Another betrayal of the promise that this time would be different. The disappointment was perhaps worse than the anger. People had genuinely hoped that Labour would be better, would rise above the pettiness and infighting. Instead, it was the same old story, just with different faces. The question now is what happens next? Can Starmer and Reeves find a way to genuinely work together, or will this Cold War continue until something breaks? Will Labour backbenchers eventually decide their leader is more liability than asset? Will the public's patience run out completely, giving the Conservatives an undeserved route back to power? Nobody knows for certain, but one thing is clear, this isn't over, not by a long way. The battle between Starmer and Reeves was just the opening shot in what could be a much longer, much bloodier war for the soul of the Labour Party. And the British people will be the ones who pay the price for this political civil war. That devastating interview might have lasted just minutes, but its consequences could shape British politics for years to come. The trust has been broken, the betrayal exposed, and in Westminster, those wounds rarely heal cleanly. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double check responses.